Okay. I have a question, probably simple-minded, but that have always troubled me. Why does the Libertarian support a percentage tax rate, which of course is progressive in its way? The rich guy pays more in absolute terms than the poor guy. Why don't you support an actual flat tax, which is to say a fixed fee?
The head tax.
Yes.
That's a very good question, and there's actually a precise analytical answer to it. The head tax is a tax which says that for the privilege of living in society, what we do is we charge you X dollars a year. There was one politician named Oliver Letwin, who was Shirley Letwin's son, who put this forward in England and nearly got lynched in his run for Parliament. And so the question is whether or not this was just a bunch of violent people or whether they had a point. And this is the point that they had. They said, look, the series of basic theory of taxation is that each individual contributes something to society such that when they pay their tax, get back the public benefits, there's interest that they have in their assets that they retain leaves them better off than they were before. That's the equation that I put in that little book. Now, the moment you start doing a head tax, you have somebody with very low income, you're going to basically charge them more than they earn, and so they're going to die because they won't have food to eat.
So that's a drawback.
This is an inconvenience. So if you're trying to create a system in which public taxation has the highest likelihood of creating Pareto improvements, a flat tax never runs into that particular problem, and a head tax will run into it all the time. Now, what this tells you, Adam, and I think it's very important, and I didn't mention it here, is the flat tax is in fact not a perfect tax. It's essentially the best approximation that we can do for mass media. So the fundamental theorem is when you enter into individual contracts and negotiation, everything is exquisitely tailored. The moment you start buying things online, you want standardized contract terms that everybody understands and uses. Taxes are a large number system. So if you try to apply the correct theory, i.e. the benefit theory, and do it on an individual basis, it would give you a series of impossible calculations if you're trying to figure out the level of residual satisfactions that each person gets from the participation in society. So what we do is we take a proxy, we call it income, and then we use that as the basis. Now, in fact, it's an imperfect proxy, because it turns out imputed income is not equal across all individuals at all ages. But you can't measure that stuff, so you do with what you can, and it's the standard institutional trade-off between the validity of the measure, which is perfect calibration in all cases, and the reliability of the measures, which is can you handle evaluation questions. And the larger the social phenomenon that you're trying to regulate, the more the reliability issue relative to the validity issue starts to happen. And that's what gets you to the flat tax. And it is robust against all sorts of political intrigue. So the resource loss that you get from the uncertainty as to what a progressive tax or a capital gains tax or an estate tax will be next year is huge. And just think of what happened in 2009 when they decided to suspend the thing because they couldn't agree on what is taking place. And therefore, that turns out to be, I think, the answer. But the correct point that comes, I have to concede, not to insist upon, it's a second best solution. It's not a first best solution. The answer basically is there is no coercive action by government which will have the same beneficent effects of voluntary transactions in competitive markets. But you can't get to competitive markets with respect to the provision of public goods. You can't get to competitive markets with respect to the operation of network industries. So there you're in second best land. And the point to understand about it is the difference between second and fifth best is not a 2% difference or a 5% difference. It's a tenfold difference. And one of the great weaknesses of pure libertarian theory is when you say all taxes are theft. You have nothing to say about why this tax is better than that, because you want to execute everybody who imposes any tax for some kind of felonious behavior. And that's not where you want to be in this world. And that's why all from Aristotle through Smith, mainly Locke, Hayek, all classical liberal dies tend to treat this as a partnership model, tend to treat proration as the norm. Where do they get that from? That's the default norm in Roman partnership law. That's the origin of all of this stuff.
You would not exclude user fees, though, would you?
Roger, of course you're right. What we were talking about was the creation of public goods. Now we alter the situation just a little bit. And what we do is we can start to develop pricing methods for access to public goods. Well, the basic intuition, again, is if you can now price a particular situation, you want to take it off the general revenue rolls. Now, how do you do that? Well, you could use gas taxes, but they're very bad proxies. Because, for example, if you take a big heavy vehicle and put 2 gallons in, it's causing much more damage than 2 gallons put in a much lighter car, which travels many more miles. Because, as we know, if you work in this line of business on transportation, weight is much more important than usage with respect to the roads, which is why it is all the trucking companies have always wanted to have a mileage base for these things rather than a weight base. And in fact, in one of his very, very best opinions, Justice Stevens figured out exactly where the cross subsidies went across states when he had the wrong system of tax design and struck down a tax because it didn't do the social optimum. So you get this wonderful spectacle. You see these guys writing about property opinions where they can't figure out anything. Everything is an ad hoc judgment. You give them an area they care about, which is interstate taxation. And at that particular point, these guys become absolute professionals. The central thing to understand is that the IQ of a Supreme Court justice varies with the level of scrutiny that you give. You give them a rational basis test, they're all morons. You give them a strict scrutiny test, they're geniuses. It's the same people, right? What it really is there's no place for rational basis discourse in American constitutional law. That's a simple proposition.
Ilya?